Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Rome and Christianity. This is only part one in our continuing study of world civilizations. Ernst Renan once said, "The Roman Empire is the lake into which all the streams of history flow, and from which all of the streams of modern history flow." So notice this is the sort of the middle point where we see everything in ancient history coming up to the Roman Empire and everything after that flowing out of that. I've made the suggestion that what makes the Roman Empire central, perhaps at least one aspect of it, is the fact of the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus that takes place right in the middle of that empire. As it's going from republic to empire, Jesus is born. The Roman Empire in the first and second centuries, giving an overview of maybe a repeat, we've covered this already. You have the Julian emperors, starting with Julius Caesar, but going on to Octavius Augustus and Tiberius Caligula, Claudius. Some of these are good, some are very good, at least from a political standpoint, some not so good. Caligula was a bit of a loose cannon. But then at the end, you have Nero. And in Nero, the whole family falls apart. Everything falls apart. He did a terrible job. Uh, we also have during this period, Jesus is crucified in the days of Tiberius. Doesn't mean Tiberius ever would have heard of him. Likewise, probably not Caligula. But when we get to Claudius, Claudius actually had, it sounds like a court case that took place between some Jewish people and somebody named Christus, the followers of this Christus. Sounds like Christ. And as a result, Claudius said, that's it. All Jews have to leave Italy. And he actually banned Jewish people from Italy. You can read about that in the book of Acts. Um, and so he very well might have heard about Christianity. Jesus had already died, buried, and risen from the dead, but his followers are continuing. And then we get, beginning in 70, the Flavian emperors. The year 69 is known as the year of the four emperors. After Nero died, he hadn't left a successor. And so Vespasian had been actually putting down the Jewish revolt in Israel at the time. And he goes back to become the emperor, leaving his son Titus to finish taking the city of Jerusalem. And then at the end of Vespasian's life, Titus becomes emperor. And he only reigns for a couple of years and dies under sort of mysterious circumstances. And his younger brother, Domitian, takes his place. People have wondered, did Domitian have anything to do with it? I don't know that that's the case, so I'm not going to say so. But we have, during that period, the persecutions against Christianity flare up. Now, Nero had persecuted Christians, and Domitian does that again, although not with the same intensity. Now, we have the Antonine emperors. Next, after Domitian, he had not left any heirs, and these are they're called the five good emperors. And you say, wait a minute, there's six there. That's because Commodus, he's going to not be very good, but the others are usually handpicked men, where the emperor will handpick a successor, and then that person. So he's handpicking the successor for ability rather than just because he's his child. And then you have a gap where things go really bad. But then finally, the Severan emperors, that some of them are okay, some are bad, some are really bad as well. Things are going downhill by this time. Now, Jesus is born. We would think Jesus was born in the year 1 AD. AD stands for the year of our Lord. But actually, the folks that were trying to put the calendar together probably got it a few years wrong. And so we normally think that Jesus was born 4 BC or maybe just a bit earlier. Because Herod the Great dies in the spring of 4 BC. So Herod the Great was still alive at the birth of Jesus. And then we have the crucifixion around somewhere between 30 and 33 AD. And then the events of the book of Acts, as well as the writing of the rest of the New Testament, takes place over the next, about 20 or 30 years. So that when Jerusalem is destroyed, for the most part, if not entirely, the New Testament has already been written. Now, the Jews already had, and the Christians already had, a Bible in their hands. The Jewish Bible, which our Jewish friends refer to as the Tanakh, that's sort of a way of describing the Torah. The T stands for Torah. The N stand Torah means law. The N stands for the Naviim, the prophets, and then the Ketuvim, that just means the writings. So the Torah, the Naviim, and the Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writings. That's what we call the Old Testament. Our Jewish friends call it the Tanakh, and that had already been around for hundreds of years before the birth of Jesus. And so they had a Bible, but now they have these new writings of the apostles, and of course that hasn't been distributed. Every copy has to be handwritten and gradually distributed. That's going to take a few hundred years, but those books are already written. And so now when we come to the apostolic fathers, beginning before the first century, or before the second century, these are the next generation of church leaders after the apostles, and they have already read some of the books of the New Testament. Now, not all of them, because they haven't. Remember, they're being hand copied and hand distributed, but they've read some of them and show evidence of that, and they're writing as well, and they're very clear. They're saying, look, we don't have the same authority as the apostles. They're special. Jesus appointed them. Their writings, you listen to them. I'm just writing you to tell you to keep following the things that they taught. And so they don't put themselves on the same level. They carefully delineate between the two. And by this time, by the second century, Christianity is officially illegal. We'd had a persecution under Nero. We'd had a persecution, at least for a time, under Domitian. Just because the persecutions weren't in effect doesn't mean that it wasn't illegal. It was. This becomes evident in a few cases. Here's a piece of graffiti. Now, this isn't any kind of official document. This is scribbled on the side of a wall. And notice you've got the caption, Alexamenos worships his God. And he's praying to somebody on a cross. And notice they're trying to be nasty, so they put a donkey's head on the one on the cross. The idea of a crucified Messiah, both to the Jews and to the Romans, was considered absurd. And yet this new movement was growing and finding adherents, even though it was being persecuted and mocked. In the early second century, we have a series of letters that go back and forth between Pliny the Younger, he was the governor of Bithynia, and the emperor Trajan at the time was emperor, so he's in Rome and they're writing back and forth. And Pliny says, now I have been taking these Christians and putting them on trial and just want to make sure that this has your approval. If they refuse to recant their Christianity, then I put them to death. I kill them. And Trajan says, good job, good job. Now, if they do deny Jesus, then it's okay to let them go. But give them, when you arrest them, give them a warning and a second warning and a third warning. And then if they refuse to deny Jesus, then just kill them. Now, I call that persecution. That was the official stance of Rome during this period. Hadrian, he's another of those Antonine emperors in the second century, reigning from 117 to 138 AD. All our dates now are in the year of our Lord. He had served under Trajan and his wife Pompeia Plotina, and when Trajan died, actually he got sick and died very suddenly. It wasn't expected. Suddenly they came out with a lasting will and testament that said, "Oh, Trajan is the new emperor," and everybody went along with it. They had been at war with Parthia, and Hadrian said, "I'm tired of war. We're actually going to leave Mesopotamia to the Parthians and we're just going to come back to the borders of Rome." And so he withdrew the troops. He was openly homosexual. He had a wife, but he also had the one he was really interested was his boyfriend Antinous. And we have statues all over the Roman Empire made to Antinous, who eventually he was a teenager and died, actually drowned in the Nile River, fell off the boat while they were visiting in Egypt and drowned. And Hadrian was really, really very upset about that. Hadrian orders a temple to Jupiter to be built in Jerusalem on the very site of the Jewish temple that had been destroyed back in the year 70 AD. Just news of this, that they didn't actually start construction, but just news they were going to do this, flares the Jewish people into open revolt, And you know about how Jerusalem had been destroyed in the year 70 AD, but it was under the process of being rebuilt. But now there's this major revolt of the Jews against Hadrian and against the Romans, and that is ruthlessly put down. It is described as the Bar Kokhba revolt because it is led by this individual Bar Kokhba, son of the star, and people were saying, "Well, this is the Messiah." And he actually was a false Messiah, and he leads them into utter destruction, and the revolt is ruthlessly put down. And after this, the Romans pass a law. Hadrian passed a law: no Jewish people within 10 miles allowed of Jerusalem, and so the site of Jerusalem, all Jews will be banished from that area. Marcus Aurelius, the another of the Antonine emperors, a Stoic philosopher emperor, and he faces a problem in that the 12th legion, one of his primary legions, had a very large number of Christians. How did this happen? Well, Justin Martyr writes of how rain had fallen in answer to prayer, where there had been a few Christians there, and they had prayed for rain because they had been stuck away from their supplies, and they were all going to die of dehydration. And so they prayed, and rain came, and a bunch of them became, oh, well, in that case, we're going to become Christians. And so, what do you do with this entire legion that has so many Christians in it? Persecution is ordered in Gaul, partially maybe in response to this. I'm not sure all the reasons for it. And Justin Martyr himself is killed. That's why we call him Justin Martyr instead of just Justin, is he is martyred in this persecution. So notice sometimes we always have Christianity illegal, but sometimes the 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 harsh persecution against it is mandated, and that will go in waves. Sometimes it will be sort of a don't ask, don't tell. But if you do tell and you're found out to be a Christian, then you're under penalty of death, and that's going to be sort of the continuum in the second and third centuries. Um, Aurelius goes on to fight a series of wars. He goes back to war with Parthia, leaving Mesopotamia had not accomplished anything. But also the Germanic tribes say, "Gee, he's busy over there, so we can revolt," and things get out of hand. And at the end of his life, he chooses his teenage son to follow him as an emperor, abandoning the idea we're going to choose the most qualified person, a good leader. His son won't be a good leader. Son is known as Commodus, if that sounds like a strange name. Probably sounds like a strange name because of what he did to it first. Coins are devalued. It is said that Rome went from a kingdom of gold to a kingdom of iron and rust under Commodus. Civil unrest breaks out. Um, he actually takes active participation in the gladiatorial games. That was considered scandalous to Romans. They would go watch the games, but they wouldn't actually participate. That was for slaves and criminals. And yet he wants to show his manliness by jumping into that. Changed the name of Rome to Commodia. Obviously, they changed it back. And eventually, after his death, they don't do this to his face, but after his death, um, there's a certain device that you find maybe in a restaurant or in a public place called the commode. It gets its name because they named it after Commodus. They said, we're not going to name Rome after him, but we will name this place of urination after him. He claimed to be Hercules reincarnated, and finally he is murdered. The year of the five emperors, and it begins with Commodus being strangled, but he had no heir, and so we have a number of different would-be emperors jumping up one after the other, and finally the Praetorian Guard auctions. They hold an auction. Who's the highest bidder? And a couple of candidates begin bidding on who's going to be the next emperor. Sold! You can be emperor, and the idea is you're going to give us a pay raise. And so the one who wins the bid, Septimus Severus, he wins the bid. The first thing he does, he gets rid of the Praetorian Guard. He says, we're not going to do that again. This idea of just holding an auction to bid for who's going to be the emperor. And he replaces the Praetorian Guard with high-paid legionnaires who are going to be loyal to the emperor, not to their own pocketbook. He basically ignores the Senate. He's not giving the Senate any power. and he invades Scotland. And at his death, again abandoning that idea, I'm going to find the most qualified person. He puts in a will the empire to his two sons. Now, if it had been one son, that might have worked out okay. But when you have two sons that are each going to get the empire, they're not going to be friendly toward each other. And that's exactly what happens with the Severan emperors. You have Caracalla, who murders his brother Geta. He's trying to pay off the soldiers because we've still got that idea in the back of the head. Soldiers get to appoint emperors, so he raises the pay. He gives citizenship to all free males. Remember, back in New Testament times, that had been a carefully guarded prize to be a Roman citizen. Now, if you're not a slave, you're automatically a citizen. He's assassinated, and now Elagabalus becomes the emperor. He's the teenage cousin to Caracalla, and he gets his nickname from this is his nickname, not his given name, from the Baal worshippers in his family. They have sort of resurrected that old Phoenician cult religion of Baal worship, and he leads the people both into that and the worship of what is called Sol Invictus, that is the worship of the sun. That's sort of a Baal worship too, and they have their different um, rites and religions, and it uses sex as part of the religious practices. Very sort of gross. He refers to himself as the queen, dresses up in a dress, and he's just not a very good role model for emperor. Um, we finally come to the barracks emperors from 235 to 284. These are all unrelated. They're called that because they're coming largely out of the military. And most of these emperors are assassinated. The average life expectancy for somebody after becoming emperor is about 3 years. So less than president of the United States. We have 4-year terms. They would have a bit less than that. Most of them are assassinated. Now, a few of them break that mold and reign for a bit longer. The soldiers, these are soldiers, they didn't necessarily come from the Senate or from political families. They're coming from the military. That is their claim to fame. In fact, one year, the year 238, is known as the year of the six emperors. You had six different people trying to, one right after the other, trying to become emperor, and each one being assassinated. Things are very unstable in Rome. Things are falling apart. Um, you have as one of those barracks emperors, Philip the Arabian. Now, he's interesting because he's actually friendly toward Christians. This is the first time we've ever seen a uh, a Roman emperor who wasn't out to kill the Christians, and that's Philip the Arabian. He actually has some Christian friends. Now, to the best of our knowledge, he doesn't become a Christian himself. If he does, he doesn't tell anybody about it. But he's got some Christian friends, and persecution now reaches an all-time low. But when he is assassinated, 249, he dies, and he's followed by Decius, who had been his political military opponent. And Decius um, reinstitutes the persecution with a vengeance, so much so that he says, "Look, we're going to go out and sprinkle the like pagan blood on all the food, so that no one can buy or sell." Unless they're giving allegiance to me, we're going to starve out the Christians. Sounds a little bit like something that had been promised in the book of Revelation. And that's Decius. Now, it's only 2 years, but it's a very intense persecution. The Roman Empire is going down, down, down. You have the Goths in the north, and at one point they're going to cross the Rhine or excuse me, the Danube, and say we'd like to, and the reason they're leaving is because they've got problem. They've got nosy neighbors that are giving them problems. You have the Germanic tribes up in what we call Germany today, and you have the Persian Empire under the Sassanids. That's the ruling group that's ruling the Persian Empire. So sometimes we call them the Parthians, but the Parthians now were no longer the ruling group. Now it's the Sassanids that are ruling, but it's still the same Persian Empire. You have the humiliation of Valerian, where one of the Roman emperors, this hadn't happened before, you'd had Roman emperors be assassinated, but never had one fallen and then been captured in battle by an enemy force. And that actually happens at the hands of the Sassanids, at the hands of the Persians. And he's made a slave before they finally kill him. You notice in this picture, he's being used as a stepping stool as the Persian king gets on his horse and just a sad state of affairs for the Roman Empire. The one who turns that around, at least from a political perspective, is Diocletian, again, coming from the ranks of the military. As he comes in, there's great political instability. You'd had these barrack emperors fighting among each other, and each one grabbing the empire for himself. Runaway inflation. Everything's about to collapse. It's amazing that there was still a Roman Empire at this point in history. The first thing that Diocletian does is to divide the empire. Now he says it's still going to be one empire, but administratively, it's too big of a job for one person to handle. So he picks out someone who is going to be his co-emperor, Maximian, a trusted general, and he says, "Look, Maximian, you will be in charge of the western part of the empire. I'm going to take the east. Of course, that's where the Goths, and that's also where the Parthians are. That's where the biggest action is. It's also where most of the money is coming out of Egypt and the food and things like that. So I'll be in charge of the east. You'll be in charge of the west, and at a certain time, when I say so, we will both retire, and in the meantime, we will have a sub. We're not going to call him a sub emperor. We're going to call him a Caesar, working for each one of us, and he's going to be getting on the job training so that when we retire, he can take over. It was a great idea. It's not going to last past the first series of retirements, but a great idea. Now, Diocletian had not started off really paying attention to the Christians. They were technically illegal, but he really wasn't focused. He was focused on bigger issues. But in the early 300s, he actually sets his attention on the Christians and he says, "Look, I've got to put Christianity away once and for all. I don't like the fact that," and it wasn't the fact that they were worshiping Jesus, it's the fact that they would not also worship the emperor and the pagan gods. If they had been sort of spiritually bipolar, where if they had worshipped both, then they would have been okay. But because of their unwillingness to also worship the pagan gods and also worship the emperor, that made them persona non grata. That made them the subject of persecution. And so he sets out finally to destroy the Christians, and he really intensely persecutes the Christians. But then at one point in the year 305, he says, "Okay, that's it. I'm going to retire." He says to the his other sub emperor, "Time to retire." And sub emperor says, "I don't want to retire." That's okay. You have to retire. And they both retire for a time. Actually, he has to come back a bit out of retirement, but then finally he does, and passes on the reins of government. But that's not going to last. That's all going to fall apart. In the closing days of of him doing that retirement, we actually have the sub emperor that he had chosen says, "Tell you what." Sub emperor had gotten very sick. Galerius had gotten very sick, and had said regarding the Christians, "Look, I'll tell you what. We've had these persecutions, but if you will pray for me," he had gotten very sick. "If you will pray for me, then I'm going to issue this edict of toleration." That's interesting. He's persecuting Christians, but he believes that the Christian God is answering prayer. And so they said, "Yes, we'll pray." Now, I'm not sure how they prayed, but he issues an edict of toleration and then dies 5 days later. So here are the Christians that had weathered the most intense persecutions for many, many, many years, at different levels, but they had been thrown to the lions and crucified and burned at the stake and everything that had been imagined, um, and they had weathered this, and now everything is about to change. But we'll look at that next time.